failure to communicate. Some men you just can't reach. So you can get what we had here last week, which is the way he wants. Well, he gets. I don't like it any more than you do.
Look at your young men fighting. Look at your women crying. Look at your young men crying. The way they've always done before. Look at the hate we're breeding. Look at the fear we're feeding. Look at the lies.
Welcome to presentation on the Compromise of 1850. Let's go ahead and let's get to it. Okay, so the whole issue regarding the California or the Compromise of 1850, it really begins with one pivotal event. One of our 7 thematic themes in AP US history is the theme of migration and movement. And in 1849, we have important migration, a movement of Americans across the continent of gold in California. The California Gold Rush was initiated in 1849. And these 49ers, what we call them, these people who left the East in attempts to strike it rich in California, led to the rapid growth of California. And by 1850, California is poised for statehood. And so the issue of California statehood becomes a significant divisive issue in the nation, and creates an atmosphere of great between North and South. So by 1850, Americans accounted for 68% of the population in California. And in addition, there was a cosmopolitan array of immigrants who had flooded into California. Sydney Ducks, Kanakas, Lineys, Paddies, Coolies, and Cascadees. And so really what you're looking at are, Australians, Canadians, Brits, Irish, Chinese. Cascadees would be the French. So by 1850, what we have is we have a population that is very diverse in California. And one thing that contributes to is that the people who fled into California in 1849, that they want to be a free state. They want to be a free state. And so in order for a territory to become a state, it must first have a certain population of 50,000, which they reach very, very quickly in California. Second, they must provide to the United States a constitution, a territorial constitution. And in that constitution, they demonstrated their support of being a free state. Now, when Zachary Taylor was elected president, Southern Whigs expected him to uphold the cause of slavery, but instead they had turned up a Southern man with Union principles, who had no more use for Calhoun's pro-slavery abstractions than Jackson had for his nullification doctrine. So what we find in Taylor is that Taylor, in many ways, is another Andrew Jackson, and people fully expected Jackson, a man from the West, a man who had been born in the South, reared in the South. Jackson, a man who often favored states' rights. Jackson, when it came to nullification and Union principles, he was very strong in that regard. And that's what we find in Taylor. So Taylor is going to come to the conclusion he is going to announce that not only does he not support, you know, California as a slave state, but he's also going to uphold the idea that he's going to say that slavery should be upheld where it existed. Okay. But had little patience about whether or not slavery should exist in the territories where he believed that it probably should not exist. And so one thing that is important to understand about Taylor is that at the end of the day, despite the fact he's from Louisiana, despite the fact that he is a slave owner and a Southerner, that he is a Union man, and he sees the powerful divisive nature that the issue of slavery has. And he wants to keep that Union intact. He knows that slavery is an issue that is very, very harmful to Union. And so he seeks to take a position against slavery in the territories, especially slavery in California, in large part because he doesn't want to see the Union in danger. Now, one of Taylor's confidants in Washington, D.C. is William Seward. We'll learn a lot about William Seward in this unit. But he's an anti-slavery politician from New York, and it seems as though Taylor, a not very seasoned politician, lacking in the skills of politics, turns to William Seward as a confidant. And Taylor's reluctance to support slavery in the territories in large part may be due to how close he was to Seward. Seward in 1848 said, quote, "Freedom and slavery are two antagonistic elements of society. Slavery can be limited to its present bounds." And so, and eventually he said it can and must be abolished. So that's what you get from William Seward. Now, by December 1849, California already had a free state constitution. And in the State of the Union address, President Taylor endorsed statehood for California and pleaded with Congress to abstain from exciting sectional topics, which might delay the process. And he essentially made the case that if you just, you know, send me a statehood bill to my desk and I will sign it, I will trust the Congress in its final deliberations as to the fate of California. So there, the spotlight over the issue of California fell on the Senate, where a stellar cast enacted one of the great dramas of American politics, the Compromise of 1850. The great triumvirate of Clay, Calhoun, and Webster, with a supporting cast that included William Seward, Stephen A. Douglas, and Jefferson Davis, and Thomas Hart Benton, are going to work out a compromise which will ultimately determine the fate of California. Now, the compromise will pass in large part due to the efforts of the great compromiser, Henry Clay. He said, "In the interest of peace, concord, and harmony," Clay called for an end to passion, party, and intemperance. Daniel Webster supported him. John C. Calhoun did not, and very few endorsed Taylor's plan for California. So essentially the plan for California statehood hit a brick wall, and it will not be able to transpire unless we see a significant compromise. Now, during the debate, Daniel Webster takes the floor in his 7th of March address, in which he says, quote, "I wish to speak today not as a Massachusetts man, nor as a Northern man, but as an American. I speak today for the preservation of the Union. Hear me for my cause." And so Webster urged Northerners to bury the passions of the past, you know. And so he really admonishes those in the North. He says, or reproach the South with the proviso. He's talking about the Wilmot Proviso. Nature would exclude slavery from New Mexico. Not take the pains usually to affirm nature, nor the will of God. So he says, you know, guys, listen, every time we criticize slavery, every time we bring up this issue of the proviso and slavery in the territories, you know, we are doing great harm to the Union. Think about who Daniel Webster is. Daniel Webster is a very staunch supporter of the Union. He wants to keep the Union intact. And he acknowledges in this 7th of March address that every time Northern politicians take aim at the South, you know, and criticize slavery and bring up the issue of the proviso and talk about no slavery in the territories, that they're doing great harm to the Union. And as for disunion, if you look at bullet 3, Webster warned the fire eaters. The fire eaters are the most intensely passionate pro-states' rights. Eventually, a fire eater is one whose support of states' rights and secession that they're so emotional on the issue that they breathe fire. You know, that's where that term comes from. And he also warns the fire eaters in the South that their hot, you know, rhetoric about disunion and secession are also doing a great deal of harm in national harmony and advancing the country down the road towards disunion, secession, and the like. And so he says, you know, what we have to do is we have to pass this compromise. You know, we have to pass this compromise, and we have to put our own sectional issues on the back burner, and we have to do what's best for Union. And so he really takes aim at both North and South, says that both are doing a great deal of harm. And ultimately what he wants is the preservation of the Union. He thinks the Compromise of 1850 will get us there. Calhoun, of course, 3 days before Webster's speech, the dying Calhoun gave his valedictory to the nation. He was sick, so he was too weak to speak for himself. Sat wrapped in flannels while James Mason of Virginia read his speech to the Senate. Calhoun's prophecies of doom were reflected in the piercing eyes that stared from the deep sockets within the shroud. And so you can imagine sitting on the floor of the Senate is Calhoun. He's wrapped in his flannels, and he's having the senator from Virginia, Mr. Mason, read his speech. And what he says in the speech, he says, quote, "The great and primary cause of danger is that the equilibrium between the two sections have been destroyed." Okay, danger, of course, the danger is disunion. What has caused this movement towards disunion, what has caused so much sectionalism and so much divide and anger, is that the balance, the equilibrium, the balance between North and South has been destroyed. He says that what has destroyed the equilibrium is that the North has, in effect, grown faster than the South in population, wealth, and power. And this happened because of the discriminatory legislation favoring the North, which includes the Northwest Ordinance, the Missouri Compromise, which excluded Southern property from a vast domain, tariffs, federal aid to internal improvements that helped to foster Northern enterprises at Southern expense. He said that the Yankees, the Northerners, had wantonly attacked Southern institutions until one by one the bonds of union had snapped. Methodist and Baptist denominations had separated into Northern and Southern churches, voluntary associations the same way. And he said, soon nothing will be left to hold the Union together except force. So, according to Calhoun, what could be done to forestall this fate? You know, if we are in danger, and if the danger that has been created by a destruction of the equilibrium, a sectional balance that once existed between North and South, according to Calhoun, what could be done to save the day? He said, because the North had always been the aggressor, the North must cease in criticizing slavery. And so when you're talking about the North must cease from criticizing slavery, that means that Calhoun wants the North to really begin to clamp down on the abolitionists. Really clamp down on the abolitionists. He also talked about the return of fugitive slaves. Give the South equal rights in the territories and consent to a constitutional amendment which will restore the South in substance the power she possessed of protecting herself before the equilibrium between the two sections was destroyed. So when it talks about the power she possessed of protecting herself, it's talking about nullification. Okay, and he says that California is the test case. It says admission of California as a free state would serve notice of a purpose to, quote, destroy irrevocably the equilibrium between the two sections. And he said in some circumstances, Southern states could not remain in the Union consistently with their honor and safety. Now, on the opposite end of the poll, we have William Seward from New York. He spoke for Americans at the opposite end in a speech of a March 11th. Seward condemned any such compromise as Clay had proposed. He said that slavery was an unjust and backward and dying institution, and that its days were numbered. And so he rejected any compromise that would keep the institution of slavery alive. And so Northerners on the very opposite end of the poll of Calhoun were also in opposition to any compromise that might keep slavery alive. He said, you cannot roll back the tide of social progress. He says that by keeping slavery, by maintaining slavery, we will be turning the clock back. So not only did the Constitution sanction the power of the Congress to exclude slavery from the territories, but he also, there is a, and I put it in yellow here, a higher law than the Constitution, the law of God, in whose sight all persons were equal. And so if you recall, Calhoun, his position is, in the Calhoun resolutions, his position is that Constitution is protected by, or slavery is constitutionally protected by the Constitution, that the slave, the extension of slavery, the expansion of slavery in the territories is protected by the Fifth Amendment, the Bill of Rights. But so Seward steps in and says, well, you know, that very well may be true. Indeed, the Constitution does protect slavery, but there's a higher law, higher than the Constitution, that we need to, that all people must first acknowledge, and that's the law of God. He calls it this higher law. So that the development of higher law ideology is developed by Seward in response to Calhoun's claim that the Constitution protects slavery, the expansion of slavery and the extension of slavery into the territories. Okay, so at the end of the day, Seward says in this present crisis, we're basically going to have one or two things are going to take place. And so I put them in contrasting colors here. One, the Union will stand. That slavery under the steady, peaceful action of moral, social, and political causes be removed by voluntary effort and with compensation. Okay? Or he says, two, Union will be dissolved, a civil war ensue, which will bring on violent but complete and immediate emancipation. So either way, he says, whatever happens, either way, whatever happens, slavery is going to die. Whether it's going to be gradually, peacefully, with the Union intact, or it's going to be dissolved, that it's going to occur due to we're going to have a situation where the Union is destroyed, civil war ensues, and slavery dies a violent, immediate death. So Seward's higher law speech caused a sensation. Southerners branded it monstrous and diabolical. Clay pronounced it as wild, reckless, and abominable, and even President Taylor condemned it. Seward's sentiments represented opinion in the upper North as accurately as Calhoun's opinions were expressed that of the lower South. So this is the compromise. Okay, so for the purposes of AP US history, the two components students need to be familiar with is the admission of California as a free state, number one, which is the biggest concession the North will get, and number two, or number 7 down there, the Fugitive Slave Law, of 1850. Now, of course, the other components of the compromise are in large part put in place to help resolve other sectional issues. between North and South. But the two we need to be familiar with, most importantly, are the two that are circled. Okay, so under the Compromise of 1850, the Utah and New Mexico territories will be established, and popular sovereignty language will be applied to both territories. California will be admitted as a free state. Between the border of Texas will be established once and for all. Okay, but ultimately, there's your Utah and New Mexico territories. There are the different plans of the Texas border. And ultimately, it was finally resolved. Big border dispute with Texas there. But one of the most controversial aspects of the compromise is the Fugitive Slave Law. Now, the Fugitive Slave Law was passed in 1850 as part of this compromise. It was at the time, you got to understand that by 1850, the abolition movement was beginning to die. The abolition movement was beginning to fade. It was losing support. Americans were becoming, they were growing tired of them. But the Fugitive Slave Law arguably was one of the greatest gifts that they could have been given. And it was probably the greatest gift since the gag rule. If you're in the old gag rule, which prevented the conversations and debates over slavery, or it's during the 1830s, that the Fugitive Slave Law really became a new focus for agitation, and one that it really helped to grow the abolition movement and to widen the depth, the sentiments, the abolition sentiments within these organizations. Groups. What the Fugitive Slave Law did was it basically stacked the deck in favor of slave catchers. The fugitive slave issue was a very important issue in the South, as a result of the Underground Railroad in the 1830s. The fugitive slave issue, the issue of runaway slaves, had grown to become a significant issue of concern for the South. The law put the burden of proof on captured blacks. In other words, captured blacks would be hauled in front of courts where they would have to prove their status. And so the burden of the proof was on them. It gave African Americans no legal power to prove their freedom. The law denied alleged fugitives a jury trial and provided that special commissioners would get paid a fee of $10 when they certified the delivery of an alleged slave to their owners, and only $5 when they refused certification. This, of course, by abolitionists would be viewed as a bribe to the commissioners. And under the Fugitive Slave Law, very few runaway slaves who were brought before these fugitive slave commissions were actually set free. It also empowered federal marshals to deputize citizens on the spot, to aid in the seizing of fugitives, and to impose stiff criminal penalties on anyone who harbored a fugitive or obstructed his capture. And of course, the law lacked a statute of limitations. So important to understand that the Fugitive Slave Law, there was already a Fugitive Slave Law in the books. It dated all the way back to 1793. But the Southerners wanted a Fugitive Slave Law that was more powerful and more strict. So of course, all throughout the northern press, Fugitive Slave Law was vilified. In the southern press, Fugitive Slave Law was hailed as a great victory. You see the slave catcher with his shackles and his ropes, riding the back of the politicians who passed the Fugitive Slave Law. Here you can see William Lloyd Garrison, white abolitionists, black abolitionists, sheltering, protecting, and harboring the slaves, which that ultimately is what's going on in the South or in the North. In the North, these slaves are running away. They're getting across the Mason-Dixon line or the Ohio River. And white citizens in the North, abolitionists, are sheltering these slaves. They're harboring these slaves and protecting them. In 1850, Congress passes the bills. This image here shows Stephen Douglas. Of course, we'll learn about Stephen Douglas in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but Stephen Douglas was instrumental in seeing to it that the Fugitive Slave section made it into the compromise. Federal law forced citizens to help in the enforcement. So if you knew your neighbor was harboring a runaway, you could be jailed, you could be fined and imprisoned. And so the law basically set it up to where it encouraged people in the North to rat on their neighbors. A Massachusetts man said that it fixed the value of a Carolina slave at $1,000, but of a Yankee soul at $5. Since to the Fugitive Slave Law was in Boston. Waldo Emerson said, quote, "This filthy enactment was made in the 19th century by people who could read and write." And he advised neighbors to break the law on the earliest occasion. So now we're seeing the importance of the Henry David Thoreau. You know, I told you what to do in our antebellum unit, able to connect these various antebellum units together. Okay, and you've got to see the connections. And so the importance of Henry David Thoreau's civil disobedience is now we're tying it to a law that they believe is unjust. They believe a law that is immoral. And the Transcendentalists urged people to follow your conscience. And if following your conscience puts you on the other side of the law, if your conscience keeps you from obeying a law which is unjust, then that's okay. And so with the Fugitive Slave Law in the North, you had an epidemic of Americans who were openly violating the Fugitive Slave Law. They were harboring slaves, protecting slaves all throughout the North, especially in New England. Vigilance committees were formed largely through churches in order to kind of create a support system for free Negroes and runaways to work to help prevent their capture. Fugitive Slave Law sent a wave of panic through northern Negro communities. Many black people, especially in the first 3 months after the law was passed, almost 3,000 free blacks and fugitives are going to escape to Canada. And also remember, in the North, there are 250,000 or 250,000 free blacks who are not slaves. They're not former slaves. They're not fugitives. They're free blacks that are walking the streets of Northern society. But now they are at danger. They are now subject to possibly being kidnapped by fugitive slave hunters and being resold back into slavery. And so Wendell Phillips, the golden trumpet of the abolition cause, one of the most significant abolition voices of the abolition movement, said that, quote, "We must trample this law under our feet." A Boston anti-slavery newspaper said of the Fugitive Slave Law, "It is to be denounced, resisted, and disobeyed." And one abolitionist said of the Fugitive Slave Law, he says, as moral and religious men, we cannot obey an immoral and irreligious statute. And so the concept of higher law prevailed over the Fugitive Slave Law, that people, are going to essentially practice what Mr. Seward preached that even though the Fugitive Slave Law is constitutional, it violates a higher law, and that's God's law. Therefore, we are not going to obey it. In Savannah, Georgia, a newspaper editor said, quote, "Boston is a black speck on the map, disgraced by the lowest, the meanest, and the blackest kind of nullification." So, in effect, what the Northerners are doing is they're practicing nullification. They're nullifying the Fugitive Slave Law, and for that, the South became very angry and resentful because they gave up California. They gave up California in the compromise to see that this law not only be enacted, but be enforced as well. And it obviously was. Let me give you some examples of what different responses in the North to the Fugitive Slave Law as it was being carried out. You got the story of the Crafts. In Boston lived a young couple, William and Ellen Craft, who escaped slavery 2 years earlier. They're from Georgia. And when they made it to Massachusetts, they made it to Boston, and they became celebrated in the anti-slavery newspapers in the North. Of course, Ellen was light-skinned enough to pass for white. She cut her hair, dressed in male attire, impersonated a sickly old white man going north for medical treatment with his slave, William. Once they made it to the North, William found work in Boston, and both Crafts joined the church of Theodore Parker, who was the head of the local vigilance committee. Remember, I talked about those vigilance committees. Okay. Publicity of the Crafts naturally attracted their owner's attention in Georgia. After the Fugitive Slave Law passed, he sent 2 agents to recapture them. Now, of course, as I mentioned before, Boston was the hub of abolitionism, and under the higher law doctrine, blacks and whites vowed to resist the law. And when slave catchers thus arrived in Boston in October of 1850, they vowed to get the Crafts. Quote, "If we have to stay here to all eternity, and if there are not enough Massachusetts men to take them, we will bring them some from the South." Parker hid Ellen in his home, where he kept a loaded revolver on his desk, and William went to ground in the house of a black abolitionist who kept 2 kegs of gunpowder on his front porch and a veritable arsenal in his kitchen. Members of the Vigilance Committee put up posters in town describing the quote-unquote man stealers, harassed them in the streets, and warned them on October 30th that their safety could not be assured if they remained any longer. And the 2 fugitive slave hunters left on that afternoon's train. Now, President Fillmore, now this of course became national news, and President Fillmore denounced the Bostonians, threatened to send in federal troops, and assured that he assured the Crafts owner that if he wanted to try again, that the federal government would help him with all means which the Constitution and Congress have placed at his disposal. The Vigilance Committee then put the Crafts on a ship to England, where they lived the rest of their lives in freedom. And so basically, Parker to Fillmore, he said, quote, Theodore Parker said, "I would rather lie all my life in jail and starve there than refuse to protect one of these parishioners of mine. I must be in reverence of the laws of God. Come of that what will come. You cannot think that I am stand by and see my own church carried off to slavery and do nothing." And there he is, Theodore Parker. So he's one of these Northern abolitionists who stands up to the abolitionists, or to the fugitive slave hunters in Boston, as it relates to the Crafts story. Fugitive slave law also, in effect, expanded the domestic slave trade, rewarding the capture of freed Negroes in the North, in addition to legit runaway slaves. Okay. Oftentimes, fugitive slave hunters would kidnap free slaves and resell them into slavery, and often at very, very high prices. Northern states respond to the fugitive slave law by passing personal liberty laws, which allowed for jury trials for escaped slaves, and laws that forbid state authorities from cooperating with the capture of free slaves. States with personal liberty laws included Connecticut, Massachusetts, Michigan, Maine, New Hampshire, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Vermont. Now, the Roger Tandy case court case, Prigg versus Pennsylvania, basically upheld the sanctity of the Fugitive Slave Law, striking that these personal liberty laws are unconstitutional. The bottom left-hand corner, you see posters like this were often plastered through the cities in the north. This one is in Boston. In the bottom right hand, of course, that's the golden trumpet of abolitionism. That was his nickname. That's Wendell Phillips. And so Wendell Phillips and other abolitionists benefited greatly from the passage of this law. Of course, related to the fugitive slave issue, you have the Underground Railroad, and here's a map showing the various routes. Note that some of the Underground Railroad lines, not all of them go north. Some of them also go south into Mexico and to the Caribbean. On my website, you will find I've got links to databases of reward posters that were created by planters in the South whose property ran away. Okay, if you look here, for example, you got Emily. You know, Emily, 17 years of age, well-grown, black color, has a whiny voice. She took with one of her dark calico and one blue and white dress, a red corded gingham bonnet, a white striped shawl and slippers. I will pay the above award if taken near the Ohio River on the Kentucky side, or $300 if taken in the state of Ohio and delivered to me near Lewisburg, Mason County, Kentucky. Theodore Williams, August 4th, 1853. This guy right here represents the Cotton Whig, the northern factory owners that supported cotton. Therefore, understand that there were those in the north that did favor the Fugitive Slave Law, and it was usually those whose livelihoods revolved around the cultivation of cotton. Next, we have the Anthony Burns story. In March 1854, Anthony Burns escaped from Virginia. He stowed away on a ship bound for Boston. The literate Burns wrote a letter to his brother, who was still a slave. Intercepting the letter, their owner learned of Burns's whereabouts and headed north to claim his property. In May 24th, Burns was arrested and placed under heavy guard in a federal courthouse. A vigilance committee was formed, and they resolved that, quote, resistance to tyrants is obedience to God. Let that quote sink in. That's a very powerful quote. Think about who the tyrants are. A group of abolitionists tried to rescue Burns in an attack on the courthouse with axes, battering rams, and revolvers. Take the rest of that. Backing up the campaign promise to crack down on aid fugitive slaves, President Franklin Pierce ordered several companies of Marines, cavalry, and artillery to Boston. He also sent a warship to Boston to escort Burns back to Virginia. The Vigilance Committee tried all legal maneuvers to stop the extradition, including raising money to purchase his freedom. The owner was willing to sell, but the U.S. attorney refused to sanction this solution. This, of course, becomes a precedent. In June, Burns was transported to Wharf while the streets were lined with sullen Yankees standing in front of buildings draped in black, with the American flag hanging upside down and church bells tolling a dirge to liberty in the cradle of the American Revolution. So Burns was returned to his master at the cost of $100,000. The Pierce administration upheld the majesty of the law. Of course, this story comes from James McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom. Textual magnate Amos A. Lawrence said that, quote, "We went to bed one night, old-fashioned conservative compromise union wigs, and wake up stark, mad abolitionists. The government dropped charges on the leaders of the riot. When it became clear that it would little success in securing an impartial jury, William Lloyd Garrison, in response to the Burns incident, publicly burned a copy of the Constitution on the 4th of July, while thousands breathed amen to his denunciation of this document as a covenant with death." Wow. The New England state passed new personal liberty laws that collided with various ways of federal law. And in Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin, they also passed stronger personal liberty laws after fugitive slave controversies in those states. Most abolitionists champion nonviolence, but the Fugitive Slave Law began to erode that commitment. As Frederick Douglass said, the only way to make the Fugitive Slave Law a dead letter is to make half a dozen or more dead kidnappers. It's in October 1850. Newspapers in several communities reported that, quote, "The colored people are arming in Pittsburgh. Revolvers, bowie knives, and other deadly weapons found a ready sale. In Springfield, Massachusetts, a white wool merchant named John Brown, warrior in his eye, organized a black self-defense league. Northern resistance to the fugitive slave law fed the resentment of fire eaters, still seething over the admission of California. Quote, "We cannot stay in the Union any longer, with such dishonor attached to the terms of our remaining." And the governor of South Carolina assumed that, quote, "There is now not the slightest doubt that the state will secede." And ultimately, I think students need to understand this, that not take place in 1850. You know, it happened in 1860, but the reason why it doesn't happen in 1850 is that at that time we had the highest cotton prices in a decade. And they didn't want Southern secession to upset cotton prices. Unionists in the South also held a number of delegates necessary to defeat secession in many of the state conventions in Alabama and Mississippi. So 1850, many Southerners were ready to leave the Union then. But it doesn't happen until 1860. Who's chasing the fugitive slave? The Southern politician, the Southern planter, and the fugitive slave hunter. No union with slaveholders. So what made William Lloyd Garrison here controversial in his own right is he supported secession. He believed that the North should secede from the slave-owning South. So there were secessionists in both the North and the South. And ultimately, this is why William Lloyd Garrison really wasn't very popular in the North, because of his denunciation of the South to the extent that he supported secession. Ableman versus Booth, another court case. Abolitionist editor in Milwaukee, Sherman Booth, roused a mob to rescue a fugitive slave. He was then convicted in federal court for violating fugitive slave law. The Wisconsin Supreme Court stepped in, basically freed Mr. Booth on the grounds that the Fugitive Slave Act is unconstitutional. And so the Supreme Court ruled in Ableman versus Booth that a state Supreme Court law. So state governments, state Supreme Courts even tried to rule unconstitutional the Fugitive Slave Law. You can't do that. That's good. One thing that Fugitive Slave Law did lead to, and I think it's extremely significant, every student must know, and that is Stowe is going to write a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Slavery seen through her eyes subjects its victims to countless brutality. The book came out in the spring of 1852, sold more than 2 million copies. During the decade, it does rank as one of the best-selling books of the antebellum period. Stowe claimed that God inspired her to write the book, but in reality, it was the Fugitive Slave Law. The thing about the Uncle Tom's Cabin that is significant is that it really what makes it very, very popular in the North. Of course, the book was banned in the South to be read or to be distributed or printed in the South. That abolitionist literature was banned in the South. And it was against the law in the South to actually send abolitionist materials through the mail. They took that very, very seriously. But what was great about Uncle Tom's Cabin, I think is great about any book, any great book or any great story, is the development of characters. She created characters that readers really fall in love with and identify with. Of course, you got Tom and Eliza, who are the kind of protagonists in the book. She spent some time observing slavery in Kentucky, her experiences with runaway slaves during the 18 years that she lived in Cincinnati. Of course, she made the image of Eliza running across the Ohio River on ice floes, or Tom's in the enduring beatings of his master, Simon Legree in Louisiana, more real than life for millions of readers. And of course, in that book, the most loathsome villain was Simon Legree, who was a transplanted Yankee. He was known, he was essentially described for, throughout the book, she really highlights his brutality and his inhumane treatment of the slaves. I think the fact that she makes Simon that he's a former Yankee, that he came from the North, that he came to become a slave owner. And it's all, I think it's along the same lines. I think it's also important to note that Stowe wanted this book, aimed at this book. She wanted her audience for this book to be those people in the North. She really wanted to elicit an emotional response to those in the North. Miss Stowe reviewed the whole nation for the sin of slavery. She aimed her novel at the evangelical conscience of the North. And this is also the backdrop behind Uncle Tom's Cabin, is we're still in the throes of the Second Great Awakening. And boy, did she hit her mark with her book here. Now, it's not Uncle Tom. Uncle Tom, the main character in the book, he's martyred. He dies for the sins of slavery. Stowe does a brilliant job in basically converting Tom as a Christ figure who comes to earth to die for the sins of man. Like Jesus, he died for the sins of mankind in order to save not only his own people, but the oppressors, those that oppress as well. Now, Stowe's readers in the 1850s, they lived in an age that understood this message much better than our age today. And near the end of the book, One of the parting lines in Uncle Tom's Cabin is, if you look at the right-hand column, it says, "As he died to make holy, let us die to make men free." Think about the significance of those words. As he died to make holy, let us die to make men free. Think about who, us is. Who is us? And he's talking about us as essentially the northern people. This book also struck a nerve in the South. The Southern writers wrote books to counter Stowe's depiction of slavery, and within 2 years, 15 books were written in the South to give a different interpretation as to what slavery was really like. Though they tried to ban it, it sold like fire in Charleston and elsewhere. Southerners would claim that Uncle Tom's Cabin was full of falsehoods and distortions. The New Orleans Crescent, the newspaper, said, quote, "There never before was anything so detestable or so monstrous among women like this." In fact, there's one book there up there at the bottom. Golly. Uncle Robin in his cabin in Virginia, and Tom and Tom without one in Boston. Wow. What he's saying is, what this title alludes to is the Southern argument that slaves in the South have shelter, they have a roof over their head, whereas many free blacks in the North do not.
Midway through the 19th century, America is entering the modern world. In 20 years, there'll be legalized jeans, chewing gum, and hot dogs. But the nation is split, being torn apart at the seams, dividing north and south. Slavery became a political issue, and it's an economic issue and a moral issue as well. It became the issue that defined Northern South in the 1850s. September 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law brings the brutality of Southern slavery to the North. Now, no African American is safe anywhere. No, you made a mistake. There's a bit of business. I'm terrible class. I'm afraid I'm not a slave yet. Fugitive slave law meant that if you were a slave and you managed to escape to the north, your master could come and get you, and you had no recourse. Not only that, if you were afraid of home, they still could sell you down the river. The search for runaway slaves become a witch hunt. Any African American can be condemned simply with an accusation. Even a free man has no right to a trial by jury. Federal magistrates get $10 to rule them slaves, $5 to set them free. Ordinary people are outraged by the new law. Abolitionist newspapers and literature spread like wildfire. Published in 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin becomes the best-selling book of the century after the Bible, a passionate anti-slavery novel written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, an unknown housewife from Connecticut. It mainly appeals to women who are becoming politicized for the first time. Slavery is a burning issue of the day. As America expands across the continent, North and South face off over each new territory. Will it be slave owning or free?
The Northerners began to see that, wait a minute, they're not going to keep slavery just in the South. They want to take slavery west and to turn the country into a slave country.
This is the final scene of a movie adaptation to Uncle Tom's Cabin. The final scene.
Tom? God, Tom! It's me, Christopher. Don't you recognize me?
Chris? It's you? Oh, Lord.
What have they done to you, Tom? I'm here to buy you back, Tom. I'm gonna take you home.
Oh,
That's right.
okay. Going through the gore now. You sell clothes. Sell her.
I will, Tom. I surely will. Oh, you can tell yourself. Tom? Tom, please don't. Don't die now, Tom.
I'm free.
Tom? Be careful now. Careful. I want you to know I'm going to report this to the first law officer I see.
Why don't you do that? Who you gonna have as a witness? What's all the fuss about? Just one more dead nigger?
You put chains on all your slaves, sir?
Yes, huh?
Well, I ain't got no chains on right now, and neither do you.
What you talking about?
This!
So during the war, Abraham Lincoln meets Harriet Beecher Stowe for the first time, then says, "So this is the little lady who made this big war." Over in England, Lord Palmerston, the Prime Minister, another reason why the British did not see during the war was due to Stowe's book. He said he admired the quote-unquote statesmanship of it. So ultimately, in closing, rather than resolve very important divisive issues between the two sections, Compromise of 1850 is going to continue to further and lead to greater sectionalism and hostility between the free and slave states, in large part due to the issue of California statehood, as well as the Fugitive Slave Law. Fugitive Slave Law ultimately is and reinvigorating and growing the abolition movement in the North against something they viewed as a very unjust law. So that's it for this session. Look for the next video. Thank you for your attention.